In 1961, the comic book industry belonged to gods. The newsstands were crowded with characters like Superman and Batman, flawless, practically invincible heroes who lived in polished, fictional utopias like Metropolis. But across town in New York, a tiny publisher called Atlas Comics was dying. Readers were losing interest, sales were flatlining, and the owner, Martin Goodman, was ready to pull the plug and shut the doors for good. Before wrapping things up, Goodman gave his exhausted 38-year-old editor-in-chief, Stan Lee, one final instruction. He told Stan to follow the current superhero trends, crank out one last comic to make a quick buck, and then they were done. Stan was ready to quit the industry altogether, but his wife, Joan, gave him a piece of advice that changed the trajectory of the company. She told him that if the business was failing anyway, he should stop chasing trends and write the story he actually wanted to tell. Accepting the inevitability of failure removed the pressure to be perfect. Stan abandoned the rigid industry rules, setting the stage for a creative risk that would replace the perfect hero with something much more recognizable. Teaming up with legendary artist Jack Kirby, Stan created the Fantastic Four. These characters were intentionally imperfect. They bickered like a real family. They made mistakes, and they actively struggled to pay their rent. Instead of hiding them away in a fictional city, Lee and Kirby dropped their new heroes directly into the grit and noise of actual New York City. The book was an instant hit, triggering an explosion of new ideas. They quickly rolled out the Incredible Hulk, a protagonist driven by tragedy and anger, and the Avengers, a team of powerful individuals who could barely stand to be in the same room together. Soon after, they launched the X-Men. The struggles of these characters functioned as a direct allegory for the real-world civil rights battles and discrimination happening outside the reader's window. But the ultimate evolution of this formula arrived when Stan teamed up with artist Steve Ditko to create Spider-Man. Peter Parker was a broke, awkward high school kid who had to juggle mundane teenage problems while carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. By writing heroes with real human flaws, Marvel changed how readers related to the page. Fans weren't just looking up at distant icons, they were looking across the street at reflections of themselves. Marvel also introduced a mechanical innovation, a fully shared universe. If Spider-Man swung through Manhattan, he was existing in the exact same physical space as the rest of the roster, flying past the Fantastic Four's headquarters. And if a cosmic threat arrived, the tremors would ripple out and affect characters in every other title. To cement this shared world, Stan Lee started speaking directly to the fans. Through his editorial column, Stan's Soapbox, and his signature sign-off, Excelsior, he built an exclusive, insider community decades before the internet existed. The numbers proved the strategy worked. By the late 1960s, Marvel was moving over 50 million copies a year, outpacing every competitor in the industry. This interlocking architecture turned individual comic issues into a singular, continuous ecosystem that effectively locked in readers for life. By the late 1980s, Marvel had grown into a massive corporate machine, scaling the universe into endless merchandise and animated television shows. But rapid expansion led to severe corporate mismanagement. When the comic market collapsed in the 1990s, the financial fallout dragged the publisher to its knees. In December 1996, Marvel officially filed for bankruptcy. Facing total liquidation, the company had to make an unthinkable decision to keep the lights on. They dismantled the interconnected universe they had spent decades building. To survive, they sold off the film rights to their most valuable properties, sending Spider-Man to Sony and the X-Men to 20th Century Fox. Marvel survived, but the price was their internal cohesion. With their most famous characters now controlled by rival studios, the company was left as a shell of its former self, facing a future where they would eventually have to bet everything on the B-list heroes they had left. By the early 2000s, the architects behind the world's most famous superheroes were virtually bankrupt, watching from the sidelines as their own creations generated billions of dollars for other people. 20th Century Fox was extracting massive theatrical rewards from the superhero boom, turning the X-Men into a multi-billion-dollar film franchise. Simultaneously, rival studio Sony was dominating the global box office with Spider-Man. Marvel was locked into outdated licensing deals. They had leased out the movie rights to their most famous characters in exchange for a tiny fraction of the box office revenue. This left the company sidelined during its own cultural renaissance. While rival studios built empires using Marvel intellectual property, Marvel itself remained a passive bystander in the industry. In 2005, a young producer named Kevin Feige and Marvel's leadership proposed a way out. Marvel would stop leasing its heroes and start producing its own movies independently. To finance this transition and launch an independent studio, Marvel secured a $525 million bank loan. They used their remaining characters as collateral. If the movies failed, the bank would take ownership of the heroes they still controlled. Properties like Thor and Captain America were the primary leverage holding this entire deal together. The terms were absolute. If the first wave of movies failed, the bank would foreclose on these heroes, and Marvel Studios would effectively cease to exist. Since their most popular icons were owned by other studios, Marvel had to launch this high-stakes venture with B-tier characters that the general public barely recognized. They selected Iron Man to lead the charge and cast Robert Downey Jr. to play him, an actor whose career was considered unbankable by major studios at the time. Director Jon Favreau was tasked with turning this combination on a secondary hero and a risky leading man into a viable franchise. We can see the result on this box office ticker. In 2008, Iron Man earned over $585 million worldwide, proving that audiences were drawn to the character's specific blend of arrogance and vulnerability. This single film's success generated the revenue needed to avoid default and validated the company's decision to self-finance. After the credits, a brief scene featuring Nick Fury introduced the idea that Iron Man was part of a larger, interconnected world. This map illustrates Marvel's plan. They would release individual character films that functioned as building blocks for a massive ensemble crossover. Many in the industry doubted the plan, citing the massive logistical challenges of coordinating different directors and production schedules into a single narrative. In 2012, The Avengers, directed by Joss Whedon, successfully combined these separate storylines and earned $1.5 billion at the box office. Disney recognized this shift in the theatrical landscape and acquired Marvel for $4 billion shortly after the plan began to take shape. Marvel turned the serialized comic book format into the industry standard for high-budget filmmaking, forcing rival studios to adopt their own multi-year, multi-film roadmaps. Today, that original $525 million loan has grown into a franchise of over 30 interconnected properties, pulling in a total of $30 billion. The 2019 release of Avengers Endgame functioned as the conclusion to an 11-year narrative arc, becoming a massive cultural event for millions of fans. The trajectory from a near-bankrupt publisher to this modern reality is unprecedented in the history of the film industry. Throughout this growth, Marvel maintained its focus on the internal struggles of its heroes, from Steve Rogers' difficulty adapting to the modern world to Tony Stark's battle with his own legacy. The $525 million gamble succeeded because it prioritized the messy, relatable growth of these characters, proving that the audience's emotional connection to a hero is what turns a story into a legend.